Most people are using AI tools today, but they are still not seeing any real results from it. And that is not because AI does not work, but because of how it is being used. A lot of people keep jumping from one tool to another, trying new features, testing new platforms, and hoping something will eventually click, but nothing really changes in how they work or what they produce. And this is why you will often see two people using the same AI tools, but getting completely different outcomes, because one is just experimenting without structure, while the other is using AI as part of a consistent system. Instead of treating AI like something you occasionally use, they are using it as something that supports how they think, how they create, and how they execute every single day. And that difference is what creates real leverage over time. In this video, I am going to show you the AI systems that actually change the way you work. Not just tools that you try once and forget, but systems that you can use consistently to improve how you think and create. And this is part one of a short series, where we are breaking this down step by step. Because once you understand how to use AI this way, everything starts to become clearer, faster, and much more effective. Before we get into the systems themselves, there is one important shift that you need to understand. Because most people approach AI in a way that naturally limits what they get out of it without even realizing it. They treat AI like a shortcut that they use only when needed, maybe to write something faster, generate a quick answer, or solve a small task, but they do not change the way they actually work around it. And because of that, the results remain inconsistent. And over time, it starts to feel like AI is useful, but not something that truly changes how they operate. But the people who actually benefit from AI are not just using tools occasionally, they are building systems around it, where AI becomes part of how they think, how they organize ideas, and how they execute tasks every single day. For example, instead of starting every task from scratch, they rely on AI to support their thinking process from the beginning, which reduces friction and speeds up decision making. And once you start using AI this way, things begin to feel different, because instead of constantly starting from zero, you are building on top of a structure that supports your workflow, which makes your thinking clearer, your actions faster, and your output more consistent over time. The first system is about how you capture ideas and turn them into usable content. And this is where voice-based AI has improved significantly in recent months in a way that most people have not fully adapted to yet. Most people still rely on typing for everything, whether it is writing messages, prompts, emails, or even brainstorming ideas. But if you think about it, we naturally speak much faster than we type, and more importantly, we think more freely when we speak without over-filtering ourselves. Earlier, voice tools required you to be precise and structured, which limited how useful they were in real situations, but now they are much better at understanding context, which means you can speak naturally, pause, correct yourself, change direction midway, and even refine your thoughts while speaking. And the system still understands what you actually mean at the end. For example, you can start explaining an idea casually, adjust it as you go, and the system will still convert it into something structured and usable. This creates a completely different experience, because instead of slowing down to structure your thoughts perfectly before writing, you can simply express them as they come, and the system converts that into clear output without extra effort. And this shift is not just about speed, it also changes how you think during the process itself. Because instead of filtering your ideas before expressing them, you can now think out loud first and refine later, which removes a lot of friction from the process. Earlier, most people would hesitate before writing something, trying to make it perfect from the start, but now that barrier is reduced because the system helps you shape your thoughts after you express them. Recently, these tools have become much better at understanding intent rather than just words, which means they can pick up incomplete thoughts, corrections, pauses, and even changes in direction, and still turn that into structured output that makes sense. For example, you might start explaining something in an unstructured way, but the system is still able to organize it into a clear format that you can use immediately. This reduces the need for constant editing and rewriting and allows you to focus more on the idea itself rather than the formatting. Over time, this leads to consistency because when something becomes easier and more natural to do, you are more likely to repeat it regularly, and that repetition is what improves both speed and quality in the long run. The second system is about reducing repetitive tasks that consume your time throughout the day. Because a large part of your work is not complex, but it is repetitive and spread across multiple small actions that constantly interrupt your focus without you realizing it. Opening multiple tabs, searching for information, comparing options, filling forms, or organizing small pieces of data may not feel heavy individually, but together they create a fragmented workflow that slows you down over time. This is where AI-driven automation has improved rapidly, because instead of just assisting you with individual steps, these systems can now perform sequences of actions on your behalf based on what you actually want to achieve. For example, instead of manually going through multiple steps to complete a task, you can simply describe the final outcome you want, and the system can handle the intermediate steps required to reach that outcome. This creates a shift in how you work, because instead of focusing on tasks one by one, you begin focusing on results, and that change in focus improves both speed and clarity in how you operate. And when this becomes part of your daily workflow, you start noticing that tasks which earlier took multiple steps and constant attention now happen with much less effort, which allows you to stay focused on more important work. What makes this even more powerful now is how these systems are evolving beyond simple automation into more adaptive workflows, where they can adjust based on context and continue tasks without needing constant input from you. Earlier, automation required strict rules and fixed sequences, which made it limited in real-world use, but now it is becoming more flexible and responsive, which means it can handle more realistic scenarios that match how people actually work. For example, if a task changes slightly midway, instead of stopping or failing, the system can adjust and continue, which makes it far more practical in daily use. This reduces not just the time spent on tasks, but also the mental effort required to manage them, because you are no longer switching between multiple small decisions throughout the day. And when that mental load is reduced, you start to notice a shift in how you work, because instead of reacting to tasks constantly, you begin operating with more focus and control. Over time, this creates a smoother workflow, where fewer interruptions lead to better decisions and more consistent output. And that consistency is what eventually improves both speed and quality in your work. The third system is about how you consume and manage information, because most people still rely on manual searching, where they open multiple sources and try to piece together insights on their own every time they need something. But information today is constantly updating, and trying to keep up manually creates both delay and inconsistency in how you stay informed. Instead of searching repeatedly, these systems allow you to define what you want to track, and they continuously scan for relevant updates in the background. For example, instead of checking multiple websites, articles, or platforms every day for the same topic, you can have the system track it for you and deliver only the updates that matter to you. This creates a shift from reactive searching to proactive tracking, where information comes to you instead of you going to find it. And when this becomes part of your workflow, you start making decisions faster because you are working with updated and relevant information without extra effort. Over time, this gives you an advantage because you are not just informed, you are consistently informed in a structured way. And what makes this system even more useful now is how these tools have improved in filtering and prioritizing information, because earlier, the problem was not lack of information, but too much of it without clear structure. People would receive a lot of updates, but still feel confused about what actually mattered, or what required their attention. But now, these systems are getting better at understanding relevance, which means instead of showing you everything, they focus on what is actually important based on your interest or context. For example, if you are tracking a specific topic, instead of getting every possible update, you start receiving only the most meaningful changes or insights that actually affect your decisions. This reduces noise significantly, and when noise is reduced, clarity improves. And when you are working with clearer information, you are able to make better and faster decisions without constantly second guessing yourself. Over time, this creates a shift in how you operate, because instead of reacting to scattered information, you are working with a structured flow of insights, which makes your thinking more consistent and your actions more confident in real situations. And that consistency becomes a real advantage over time. The fourth system is about building and creating faster, because one of the biggest barriers for most people is not the lack of ideas, but the complexity involved in turning those ideas into something real and usable. Whether it is a website, a landing page, a tool, or even a small digital product, the process usually involves multiple steps, tools, and decisions, which often leads to delays or hesitation. But with recent improvements in AI-driven creation tools, that process is becoming much simpler and more accessible. Now, instead of needing to manually design and structure everything, you can describe what you want to build, and the system generates the layout, components, and structure for you in a way that is much closer to a usable output. For example, if you want to build a simple landing page or a small project, you can explain your idea, and the system can generate a structured version that you can refine instead of starting from scratch. This reduces the barrier to execution and makes it easier to move from idea to action, which is where most people usually get stuck. And once you start taking action more consistently, you begin to build momentum. Because instead of waiting for perfect conditions, you are actively creating and improving over time. What makes this even more powerful now is the improvement in the quality of output. Because earlier, AI-generated designs or builds often looked generic or incomplete, which meant you still had to spend a lot of time fixing them manually before they became usable. But now, the outputs are much closer to real-world usability, with better structure, better layout, and more logical organization, which makes them far more practical for actual use. This means the gap between idea and execution has reduced significantly, allowing you to move from concept to working version much faster than before. Earlier, most people would spend a lot of time planning, structuring, and trying to get everything perfect before starting, which often delayed execution, but now that process has flipped, where you can start quickly and refine as you go. And when execution becomes easier, something important happens. You start experimenting more, because the cost of trying something new is much lower. You test different ideas, explore variations, and improve what works instead of staying stuck in planning. And over time, this builds real momentum, because instead of waiting for the perfect idea, you are consistently creating, learning, and improving based on real output, which is what actually leads to better results. Now, when you combine all of these systems together, something important starts to happen, because you are no longer using AI occasionally for isolated tasks, but consistently across different parts of your workflow in a connected way. Instead of switching between unrelated actions, you begin operating within a system that supports how you think, create, and execute throughout the day. For example, you might capture ideas using voice, process, and organize them with AI, automate repetitive steps that would normally interrupt your flow, and then use creation tools to turn those ideas into something real. And when this becomes part of your daily routine, your work starts to feel more structured and less fragmented. Earlier, you would constantly switch between tasks, lose context, and restart things multiple times. But now the workflow feels more continuous, where each step connects to the next without unnecessary interruption. Over time, this creates a noticeable shift, because instead of reacting to work, you begin operating with more control, more clarity, and more consistency in how you approach everything you do. And that difference becomes very clear in your output, Now, to make all of this more practical, let's look at how these systems actually work together in a real situation, because understanding them individually is useful, but the real value comes from how they are used together in a workflow. Imagine starting your day with a simple idea that you want to turn into content or a project. Instead of sitting down and trying to structure everything perfectly, you begin by speaking your thoughts naturally, capturing ideas without filtering them too much. Then you use AI to organize those thoughts into something more structured, while automation handles repetitive steps that would normally slow you down. At the same time, your research system is already feeding you relevant information in the background, so you are not starting from zero. And once everything is ready, you use creation tools to turn that idea into something real, whether it is content, a page, or a small project. This creates a flow where each step connects naturally to the next, instead of feeling like separate tasks, and that is where the real efficiency comes from. And the real advantage of this approach comes from how these systems compound over time, because each small improvement may not feel significant on its own in the beginning, but when applied consistently, they start to build on top of each other in a very noticeable way. You save time on repetitive work, you reduce mental effort in making small decisions, and you execute faster because the barrier to starting is much lower than before. And when these improvements stack together, something important happens because your overall workflow becomes more efficient without you needing to consciously think about every step. For example, tasks that earlier required multiple steps and constant attention now feel smoother and more natural because the system supports you in the background. And over time, this creates a gap between those who use AI occasionally and those who integrate it into how they work every single day. This gap is not immediate, but it becomes very clear as consistency builds, because small improvements applied regularly always outperform inconsistent effort in the long run, and that is where the real advantage begins to show, because the people who stay consistent with these systems are the ones who move ahead without even realizing how far they have come. At the same time, it is important to understand why most people still struggle even when they have access to these tools, because the problem is usually not the tools themselves, but how they are being used. One common mistake is trying too many tools without building a system, which leads to confusion instead of clarity. Another mistake is expecting instant results without consistency, which causes people to stop before they see real progress. And sometimes, people rely too much on AI without applying their own thinking, which reduces the quality of what they produce. The key difference is not in using more tools, but in using a few systems consistently and intentionally. Because when you focus on building a repeatable workflow instead of chasing every new tool, you start to see real improvements over time, and that is what actually creates results. At the same time, it is important to understand what happens if this shift is ignored, because the impact is gradual and often goes unnoticed in the beginning. Everything may feel normal at first, and your current way of working may still seem effective, but over time, tasks begin to take longer, decisions feel more difficult, and progress starts to slow down without a clear reason. And this is not because you are doing something wrong, but because others are starting to work differently, using systems that allow them to move faster and more efficiently. For example, while one person is still managing tasks manually, another person is using systems that reduce effort and improve consistency, which creates a difference that keeps growing over time. And once that gap becomes large enough, it becomes much harder to catch up, because the difference is no longer just in tools, but in how work itself is structured. That is why adapting early matters, because once this becomes the standard way of working, staying behind requires much more effort than staying aligned from the beginning. And that gap only continues to grow. So now you understand the systems that improve how you work, how you think, and how you create, but if you look at everything we just covered, there is a deeper shift happening here. You are not just learning how to use a few tools more efficiently, you are starting to change the way you approach your work entirely, because instead of reacting to tasks, you are beginning to operate with structure, clarity, and consistency. And that alone can make a big difference in how you perform over time. But at the same time, this is only one part of the equation, because efficiency on its own does not automatically turn into results unless it is applied in the right direction. And that is exactly what we are going to break down in the next video, where we will focus on the systems that actually turn this into money, and how people are using AI not just to improve their workflow, but to build real income streams from it in a practical and repeatable way. Because tools by themselves do not create results, systems do, and once you connect efficiency with the right direction, everything starts to change in a much bigger way than most people expect.